Just a couple more. Boom. All right, good morning. Thank you very much for your participation this second day. We are thrilled to count on your attendance this morning as well. So thank you very much for being a part of the second part of this very important conference on security development challenges for Portugal, Europe, and Africa. On behalf of Professor Luís Rodrigues from the Center of International Studies and from Professor Helena Carreiras from the National Defense Institute, we will now open the first panel of the morning, centered on the topic migrations and human security. Before we begin, just a few technical notes. We remind you that this session will take place entirely in English, but that the option of simultaneous translation to Portuguese will be provided as well. In order to benefit from it, simply click on the interpretation button in the lower right-hand bar of your Zoom screen, and then click on the language that you want to hear. And additionally, if you want to hear only the respective translation, click on mute original audio. We also remind you that this session, as much as the remaining ones, does foresee a period of Q&A with our panelists after their respective interventions. So we ask that any questions to that end be placed in writing in the chat in a timely manner. And without further ado, I would give the floor to our moderator this morning, Professor Giulia Daniele from ISCTE and the Center for International Studies as well, who very graciously accepted our invitation to steer the coming proceedings. Giulia, over to you.
Thank you very much, Pedro. Good morning, everyone. Well, as we know, dispossession and the forced migration are significant elements of our contemporary time. And so for this reason, with the other colleagues from the Center of International Study and from the Instituto de Defesa Nacional, we decided to focus this panel on some of the extremely crucial issues to be discussed in relation to this topic, and in particular, from looking, for instance, from everyday experiences of migrants and refugees to dealing with legal and policy-centered framework, specifically around relations between EU and Africa. So it's a really great pleasure to be the chair of this panel today that is entitled Migration and Human Security. We have we have the participation of excellent speakers, Emmanuel Biozzi, Amanda Bissong, and Susana Ferreira. So as the other panels, also this panel will last about 1 hour and a half. And each speaker has about 15 minutes, and then we have enough time for our Q&A session. So just other two reminders that our speakers already know, and Pedro just remind us, we have simultaneous translation, so please, if you can speak not too fast in your during your presentation, it would be very appreciated. And again, for the public, please feel free to write your question or your comments in the chat, and we will try to approach all of them at the end of the three presentations. So let's start. I introduce the first speaker. We will follow the alphabetic order as in the program. So the first speaker is Emmanuel Biozzi. She's a senior research consultant with the Institute for Security Study Africa in the Immigration Program. Over the past decade, she has conducted research on the intersection of migration with other prevailing issues such as climate change, gender, asylum law, human smuggling, violent extremism, and citizenship. She has authored multiple policy-oriented and research reports. Her work has focused on high-risk and fragile environments in Africa, as well as across West, Central, and South Asia. Her contributions are grounded in real-life perspective from migrants themselves, to give a voice to those who are not here and to effect changes to policy and practice that are grounded in migrant experiences. From this perspective, today, Emmanuel will explore and will try to examine the major ways of refugees from Africa to Europe. Please, Emmanuel, the floor is yours. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Julia, and thank you for having me here today. So I'm going to start by sharing some characteristics about African migration. And I'm hoping that this will start the process of debunking the narrative that African migration is first and foremost desperate, irregular, cross-Mediterranean movement on overfull, rickety boats. African migration is overwhelmingly African and overwhelmingly regular. So far more Africans move across land borders on the continent than cross any sea, and far do so regularly than irregularly. So to highlight this, I'm going to give a couple of statistics. So 19 million, I'm going to try and say it slow for the translators. 19 million African migrants are living within the continent, but outside their home countries, compared to 17 million total that are out of the continent. 26% of total African migrants are in Europe. The number of African migrants in the world is dwarfed by other regions. So 14% of total global migrants are African, compared to 41% from Asia or 24% from Europe. 80% of Africans hoping to migrate want to stay in Africa and have no interest in leaving the continent. Only 15% of African migration is irregular, so that means 85% is regular. The rate of migration within the continent is growing faster than other regions. So the number of migrants on the continent grew 76% between 2000 and 2019. Even in the sea, far more Africans are using the eastern route from the Horn of Africa to Yemen and onwards to the Gulf countries than are crossing into Europe. So 800,000 Africans have crossed since 2006. Now, as a whole, Africa views migration primarily from a development perspective. Not perfectly, but as a whole, they're trying to move to really prioritize regional integration and development, and are working towards free movement and free trade. So Europe, in contrast, prioritizes stemming migration flows from Africa. So to start the process of really querying why it's a priority for Europe, I'm going to give a few more statistics. Irregular migration to Europe has slowed considerably since the peak of the crisis, as we were calling it, in 2015. I'm going to use UNHCR numbers because they cover the Mediterranean, and not a lot of African migrants are using the land bridges through the Balkans or even through Turkey. So 1.03 million people crossed in 2015 at its peak. In 2020, that number had fallen to 95,000. And in case you think that's just COVID, in 2019, it was 123,000. So we're looking at a significant downward trend in irregular migration since its peak. A minority of the arrivals are African. So African asylum applications make up approximately 15 to 20%. They're dwarfed by applications from Syria, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Turkey, and even now Colombia, Venezuela, and sometimes Bangladesh. In 2019, only 6% of effective returns ordered out of Europe were to African countries. Europe, while recognizing the benefits of free movement and trade within the EU, has increasingly applied a security and externalization approach towards African migration, meaning it's prioritizing stemming the migrant flows, and sometimes at all costs. So I'm going to speak of externalization and securitization here today. By externalization, I mean preventing irregular migration by containing people outside of Europe and enforcing returns. Basically expanding Europe's border control regime to neighboring countries. By securitization, I mean framing migration as an existential security threat and thereby limiting migration possibilities and flows. The most famous case is the Turkey deal, where the EU paid Turkey 6 billion euros and dangled EU membership in exchange for stopping migrants from moving onwards and accepting forcibly returned non-Turkish migrants. There are now 3 million people stuck in Turkey, and the deal almost collapsed early in 2020. Still, I have personally heard it heralded as a success. So when it comes to Africa, despite comprising a relatively small number of irregular arrivals and maintaining a relatively flat migrant flow over the years, it's clear that Europe is directing a lot of its securitization and externalization towards the continent. We see this through many policies, including the European Neighborhood Policy, the Joint Valletta Action Plan, the Africa-EU Strategy, and the new Migration Pact. Under the new partnerships framework, for example, 13 of 16 priority countries were on the continent. The EU Emergency Trust Fund for Africa, which has become the major migration funding mechanism on the continent, has ultimately attempted to bundle development with border control under the auspices of addressing root causes of migration and preventing long-term migration flows. A closer look, though, reveals more spending on securitization and externalization measures, such as training border patrols, than on projects with actual development potential. And Africa has really resisted this. So across multiple policy, bilateral and multilateral policy platforms and agreements, Africa has resisted agreeing to securitization and externalization measures. And that's despite mounting pressure from Europe. In many cases, this has frustrated European policymakers. So to break some of this down, we've already said that Africa's priorities are integration and development. So measures to prevent migration or to force movement and returns can really risk these priorities. A big part of the resistance is remittances. So in 2018, 81 billion US dollars was remitted to Africa. In most of countries, remittances are bigger than overseas development assistance and foreign direct investment combined. And migration is also an outlet for a large and frustrated youth population that are often chronically underemployed. When it comes to third country returns, there's often resistance to migrant populations already, and a sentiment that these key transit countries are already taking on more than their fair share. So politically, leaders who have agreed to aspects of securitization or externalization have been punished internally. They just can't be seen blocking movement or forcing returns without paying a price domestically. I'm going to give two cases to show how securitization and externalization have impacted negatively. The first is Niger. So in 2020, the ISS conducted a study examining the impacts of the European policies in Agadez, Niger, and it revealed many adverse impacts. So Agadez is a key transit point between West Africa and the Sahel and Maghreb. It's estimated that 1/3 of all migrants traveling through Agadez end up on a boat to Europe. So it became a focal point for EU interventions as of about 2015, 2016. It's a very poor region in a very poor country. Now, the EU's interventions to dismantle the migration industry, as they put it, have significantly diminished the local economy. So traders who provided goods and services like food, hotel, water, or phones to migrants passing through have now lost their livelihoods. The EU Trust Fund pledged 243 million euros to support agriculture and development and promised to replace these livelihoods, but it hasn't arrived and been implemented fast enough. So many people have been disenfranchised. And notably, while measures have curtailed the local smuggling industries, they have unwittingly contributed to the rise in others. So small Nigerian smugglers, or smuggling operators even, like drivers or hostel operators, have lost their business. But large criminal syndicates have been able to adapt and to continue smuggling. So, for example, Sudanese smuggling syndicates have capitalized and are now offering new and riskier pathways through less traveled parts of Chad and Sudan, including active conflict zones, at 5 times the cost. And on top of that, the government's inability to protect the local economy has eroded public confidence. One official we have quoted as saying, "The locals ask us why we work for the EU rather than them." The second and final case, excuse me, is Libya. So the situation for migrants in Libya has been called a human rights black hole. So migrants are facing extreme forms of violence, indefinite detention, excuse me, extortion, torture, sexual violence, conscription, and forced labor. There are an estimated 600,000 migrants of 46 nationalities there. Many are trying to reach Europe. The reports of migrants being killed or tortured at the hands of the militia or Coast Guard are countless. I mean, at this point, we're getting new ones weekly or monthly. It's become clear that armed groups are running unofficial migrant detention centers that are operating as lucrative trafficking and smuggling hubs, where migrants are forced to call their families for ransom or sometimes even sold into slavery. And it's also become clear that some officials are in on them and that oversight, even in the official centers, is murky at best. The EU Trust Fund has provided Libya with over 435 million euros. So then this includes direct funding to the Coast Guard, whose very members have been implicated in running these centers. So again, these activities are being funded, some of them have been funded by tax dollars under the auspices that we're saving the lives of those making dangerous journeys by land or sea. And I think we can all agree that at this point that that's utter nonsense. So in conclusion, I'll say that the European agendas tend to dominate African migration policymaking, and they're currently interfering with African priorities. The continued focus on restrictions and spending on borders at all costs is just not in Africa's best interests. Africa has a responsibility to protect African people first and foremost. And we need to, excuse me, recognize the severe costs of these approaches to Africa and Africans. And I'll end there.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel, for this very insightful overview of the reality of African migration flows, and by highlighting also some of the major, the most critical key concepts in the current debate. The second speaker today is Amanda Bisso. Welcome, Amanda. She's a policy officer in the migration program of the European Center for Development Management, Maastricht. She has a background in law and master degrees in international law and economics and international trade policy and trade law. She's currently doing her PhD on migration governance in West Africa at the Faculty of Law at Vrije University of Amsterdam. Her focus research areas are on migration agreements, labor migration, exploring the linkages between trade and migration in Africa, migration governance, and the interplay between regional and national commitments. In recent years, she has published several research articles on migration governance. Today, Amanda will focus in particular on the EU initiative at this level and on the partnership EU-Africa. Amanda, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julia, for the introduction, and thanks a lot, Emanuele, for the lovely presentation, setting the scene already with the figures and some details on African migration. In my presentation, I will focus more on looking at the EU-Africa partnership as it relates to migration cooperation. So looking broadly at the levels of engagement between Europe and Africa, we see that there are several layers to these engagements. You have discussion platforms at the level of the African Union Commission and the EU Commission, so continent-to-continent approach. You also have support at the regional levels, which looks at promoting intra-regional mobility, as Emanuele has aptly stated, that most of the mobility and migration within the region, within African countries, within the continents area, occurs within regions in Africa. And here we see the support to existing free movement protocols at the regional level. And we also see support to promoting responses in terms of displacement and refugee situations using regional approaches. We also see that there's another level of cooperation that's bilateral, and here it focuses on support to border governance, like Emanuele had already stated, looking at externalization in some cases and securitization of migration. Most of these measures occur at the bilateral level more explicitly. Here we also see the focus on returns and reintegration, looking at legal mobility programs, the focus on remittances and diaspora engagement. But if we look more generally at EU migration agendas, we see that since 1999, when the EU began with its Tampere program, that the focus on migration cooperation with external countries, especially African countries, has already been in the EU programming. So looking towards having a stronger external action with third countries, focusing more on the external borders of the EU. And also you see this carry through in the Hague program, where it looks at migration management and establishing a common asylum area within the EU. And more recently now, we saw this in 2015 in the European Agenda on Migration, which equally focused and identified priority countries for cooperation on migration. I think 3 out of the initially identified countries were in Africa. And lastly, now with the new migration, with the new Pact on Asylum and Migration, a lot more of these countries are located, a lot more of the priority countries are located in Africa. In 2015, I think it was already mentioned in the previous presentation, we also saw the discussions on the Joint Valletta Action Plan with 5 priority areas. This led to the establishment of the European Trust Fund and the support now to African countries under these 5 priority areas. So more generally, if we look at the areas of support between the EU and African countries, we can see that the support is generally aimed towards promoting intra-African legal migration through the support to regional economic communities and integration, looking at RECs like ECOWAS in West Africa, EAC in Eastern Africa, and also supporting the AU in implementation, the African Union in implementation of the Free Movement Protocol that was recently adopted, and supporting mobility as relates to the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. But we see a more intensified focus on strengthening border management, discouraging irregular migration, and promoting returns, which has been highlighted in the previous presentation. Of course, there is cooperation with African countries to try to strengthen border management measures and to restrict irregular migration. And that has been stated previously, this measures undertaken to restrict irregular migration also counteract the initial measures taken by the EU to promote intra-regional migration. So it's sort of working at cross purposes here. Again, we see that there is a focus on promoting legal avenues or new avenues for legal migration between EU and between EU countries and African countries. Here, there are a handful of pilot projects that have been implemented in priority countries between European countries and African countries, and priority African countries. Of course, it can always be argued that the number of pilot projects can be increased, or the focus and scope of the pilot projects can be increased, but for now, there are a few of these projects. Looking at remittances, which was earlier mentioned, we also see that the EU supports measures that are aimed at facilitating the transfer of remittances from European countries to identified priority African countries through several projects supported by other international organizations, implemented by other international organizations. And we see, lastly, that the EU also supports responses in terms of displacement and refugee situations. Now, if we move to the other side, looking at the African agenda on migration, then we can here, through several policy documents, identify the priority areas for African countries when it comes to migration. As was stated in the previous presentation, also the focus on migration and development is pretty high at the AU level. And we look at the migration policy framework for Africa, the common position on global compact, the AU Agenda 2063, which identifies also migration as as one of the key priorities, and more recently, the AU Free Movement Protocol. We see that these policies basically highlight migration and development issues, facilitate, that also identify facilitating the remittances, diaspora engagement, legal mobility, promoting legal mobility pathways, and looking at responses to be taken in terms of protection of persons, displaced persons or refugees. And if we look now at the level of a cooperation between European and African countries when it comes to dialogues and partnerships, especially in the context of the EU-AU partnership, we see that there are also several layers or several levels for discussion and dialogue. So the first is the EU-AU summit. Migration here was included in the joint statement in 2005. You have college-to-college meetings between the AU and the EU Commission. You have the continent-to-continent dialogue on mobility, migration and mobility dialogue. You have the Rabat process, the Khartoum process, which have all been incorporated now or form part of the Joint Valletta action plan. And you have a supported global compact on safe, orderly and regular migration, which the EU supports the implementation of certain objectives of the GCM through bilateral means in member states. Now, looking at this general overview of layers and levels, what does it say? It says that migration is definitely a priority for the EU in discussing, and it has come up with several of these forums and platforms for discussing migration issues with African countries. But now, while the EU may have, if we look at some of the challenges, we see that migration it still remains a highly politically charged issue. So although it's discussed in several platforms, it doesn't change the fact that it's politically charged. And as Emmanuel already stated, sometimes cooperation, when African states choose to cooperate with the EU on migration issues, they pay prices domestically also for this cooperation. A few examples have been in the Gambia, where protests were led by returnees who were not given what they were promised in terms of their reintegration support, and they began protests domestically that almost destabilized the country politically. Another example has been in Mali, where the EU wanted to cooperate with Mali on returns and reintegrations, and this led to domestic protests that led to the Mali refusing to cooperate with the EU on returns and reintegration, and the proposed agreement that's supposed to be signed was not signed by the Malian government. Again, we see that the cooperation on migration with African countries is actually focusing on identified priority countries for the EU. So we see this, the selected countries in North Africa, selected countries in West Africa, selected countries in the Horn of Africa are the focus of these cooperation activities, but it doesn't include other countries. So for example, smaller countries who depend a lot on remittances do not benefit from some of these migration cooperation measures, whereas if we're looking more on migration and development issues, then these countries who have in some cases more than 30 or 31% of their GDP linked to remittances would benefit more from some of these projects or programs. Again, we see that because there are several venues for discussion of migration issues, and the EU does have resources to engage and in most cases create these venues for discussion and programs. But on the side of the African countries, there are limited resources to engage and discuss on these migration issues. So there is some sort of a stretch when it comes to the amount of man hours that can be devoted to taking part in several of these platforms or several of these meetings discussing migration issues. And while the EU does indeed understand how to navigate the different layers, the continent to continent, the bilateral, the regional, and how to push for different agendas in each layer for the African partners, the resources are a bit more limited when it comes to engaging on these different platforms and how to organize, to push for their own agendas through these platforms. Now, again, we see that in some of these layers, civil society participation is quite limited, and then the price here is that the focus on human rights, the focus on the rights of migrants, the focus on conditions in which people are returned the focus here is reduced because you also do not have this watchful or monitoring aspect of the civil societies being involved in these discussions. And lastly, one of the challenges that we face with this cooperation, especially the focus mostly on state to state, is cooperation is the fact that the addressing falling standards of human rights the fact that falling standards of human rights are not addressed through these platforms, especially when it comes to irregular migration. So I mean, really already mentioned the deplorable state in which migrants are kept in Libya, the fact that the EU also supports the Libyan Coast Guard in conducting returns to these detention centers is something that has been criticized globally. However, steps have not been taken to address these issues by the EU. Of course, if we look at some of the opportunities for these platforms that exist, is the fact that there is a dialogue between European and African states on the issue of migration, and increased cooperation between European and African states on issues of migration have also led to at least a shift. In some cases, we can say that the focus on legal mobility pilot projects are an example of some sort of cooperation that has been going on. Now, lastly, if we look at and try to anticipate for the coming years, the areas that would be more highlighted in the cooperation between EU and Africa, when we look at the partnership, one of the main areas remains legal pathways to migration. So looking more at the future of these these pilot projects, whether or not they'll be extended, whether or not the scope will also be increased, And here the EU has already started with the discussions on the talent partnerships and trying to see how this can be designed moving forward to incorporate third countries, including African countries. Of course, on the continent, the focus will still remain promoting intracontinental mobility, especially as it relates to the AFCFTA and the opportunities that exist for mobility on the continent. There are still several challenges to mobility on the continent. There's no one agreed or defined African agenda on migration because different countries still have their priorities when it comes to migration issues, and there is a lot of work to be done there on promoting intracontinental mobility. Again, the focus on migration and development will still be maintained with diaspora engagement taking the lead now through COVID-19. We've seen a lot of measures that have been implemented by diaspora organizations. And so this has brought the diaspora engagement to the focus again. And so more African countries are coming up with ways of engaging with the diaspora towards economic development and growth of their countries. The focus on remittances still remains because the certain transfer corridors within the continent are quite high, and the idea would be to reduce the transfer fees in line with the SDGs. The human rights of migrants is still one area that will dominate the discussions moving forward, especially with these falling standards that are currently being implemented now. And so African countries are still pushing for recognition and the protection of the human rights of migrants, whether they are regular or irregular. Human rights are human rights and should be protected. Again, protection of the rights of migrant workers within the continent and outside of the continent is also an area that the EU is paying a lot of attention to. And this is not just looking at African migrant workers within the EU, but also African migrant workers in other regions, especially if we look at the Gulf and Middle East countries, where there are a lot of African migrant workers. And lastly, one area that would still be of focus moving forward in the partnership is the area of displacement, how to address issues of displacement and refugee situations, and requiring support to implement certain measures on responding to displacement and refugee situations. So these are some of the areas that will still require a lot of support moving forward in the context of the EU-AU partnership. However, what we have seen so far, if we take a look at the recently concluded post-Cotonou agreement, is the fact that these top areas did not really feature. I mean, migration and development did feature in the post-Cotonou agreement, but the areas of returns, readmissions, and reintegration still managed to find its way there, which is not necessarily a priority for most African countries. So the idea would be moving forward that African countries would push a lot more for the inclusion of their own agendas in terms of the cooperation in the partnership between the EU and the AU. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amanda, for this very detailed and clear analysis of the many issues, areas approaching the EU migration agenda, African migration agenda, and of course the partnership cooperation EU and Africa, and also for giving us a few ideas on the major challenges as well as opportunities related to this. Now our third speaker will be Susana Pereira, the Portuguese representative of this panel. Welcome, Susana. She holds a PhD in International Relations and International Security from Universidade Nova de Lisboa and UNED, Universidade Nacional de Educação à Distância, having received the UNED Extraordinary Doctoral Prize. She is assistant professor at Antonio de Nembrija University and director of the Master in Risk Management in Conflicts and the Master in International Relations. She's a researcher at the Security Research, Risk and Conflict Management Group, associate researcher at the Portuguese Institute of International Relations, IPRI, the research group on public policy, international security and global governance at the European University of Madrid, and the part of the Security and Defense Research Center of the Instituto Universitario Militar. Her research areas are migrations, international security, border management, the Mediterranean and the European Union, in which she has several national and international reference publications. Today, Susanna will approach the impact of migration towards Europe and their major implications specifically at the level of human security. Please, Susanna, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julia. Thank you so much for the invitation to the Instituto de Defesa Nacional and the Center for International Studies of ISCTE for organizing this conference. And it is a pleasure to join such a compelling discussion with my colleagues, Amy, Noel, and Amanda, and you, Julia, this morning. So I would like to focus my presentation on the topic of human security, highlighting mostly the dialectics between migration management and human security through the dimension of maritime environment. So we have seen now in the latest years, irregular migration has emerged as a contemporary security risk, as well as the humanitarian concern, given the rising toll of death in the Mediterranean over the last years. This sea has become the world's deadliest border, with thousands of migrants dying in the attempt to make this dangerous crossing. So in the last decade, and particularly in the last years, the European borders, and especially the maritime environment, have become a site of human emergency and crisis. Actually, the recent images of the rescue of babies and minors at sea in Ceuta highlights this humanitarian challenge and stresses the need to address these tragedies. But how to respond to the humanitarian tragedy in the Mediterranean Sea? A worry shared by all of us participating in today's conference. So in light of this humanitarian challenge, it is critical to address the human security dimension of maritime security. And we have seen now in recent years, discourses on maritime security have placed the individual at the center and given the individual and considered it as a crucial element, central to all dimensions. Nevertheless, it is still overlooked from a theoretical point of view, actually. So the human security dimension of maritime security, it emerges as a paradigm shift, moving towards a comprehensive understanding of security, and to include a wide range of issues related to the safeguarding of people's safety and security. And although seaborne migration is not a new reality in itself, the modern aspects of this phenomenon are related to two specific factors, which we have actually mentioned some. So on the one hand, on our irregular migration is increasingly more composed by mixed flows that include both forced and voluntary movements. And on the other hand, the growing importance of the businesses of migrant smuggling and trafficking within, in this specific case, well, of the maritime routes, right? So within a human security approach, the smuggling and trafficking of migrants by sea represents a threat to maritime security. The risks of traveling across the sea include, for instance, the hazard of drowning and the exposure to weather conditions during sailing, which are alarming. Furthermore, the unseaworthy conditions of vessels with migrants traveling in overcrowded boats with limited supplies and insufficient life jackets might trigger situations of high distress. Moreover, those who risk their lives in these dangerous journeys usually have little swimming capacities. So all in all, the crossing of the migratory maritime corridors presents a set of risks that directly affect migration, particularly trafficking victims, given their vulnerability as migrants are exposed to the danger of the sea and completely unprotected. So according to the IOM Missing Migrants Project, the Mediterranean routes are actually the deadliest smuggling routes by sea, despite the fact that we have seen a stiff drop from around 5,100 registered deaths in 2016 to 1,500 in 2020. Two main reasons explain this reality. So on the one hand, given the long and busy smuggling routes, a larger number of people are exposed to the risk of IC for a longer time. And on the other hand, the brutal behavior of smugglers operating in this route, who arrange for these unsafe travels without the proper conditions for migrants to reach a safe harbor. So actually drowning in the end is a major risk in those journeys. However, maritime migration comes with specific legal commitments under international law. The 1982 United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, UNCLOS, safeguards the principle of search and rescue, the SAR principle, that is the obligation to provide assistance to save life at sea. The SAR obligation applies to anyone at sea, regardless of their nationality or even the circumstances in which they are found. Additionally, rescue operations have to comply with another important principle, the principle of non-refoulement. That is the prohibition of expulsion or return of a refugee or asylum seeker to a territory where his or her life or freedom might be at risk. However, this principle, as we know, is frequently violated, and people are returned to transit or origin countries where their lives might be threatened without having the possibility to even apply for asylum. We are not talking, as I said before, about a new phenomenon. Actually, the term, the concept of boat people was coined in the 1970s to identify those individuals who fled from Indochina in fishing boats after the Vietnam War. In that moment in time, actually, thousands perished at sea, many actually at the hands of pirates in the Gulf of Thailand. And while some of these individuals found asylum in neighboring countries, many other Asian nations at the time refused to accept refugees from Vietnam. And this reaction of regional actors resembles today's reality in the European Union and specifically in the Mediterranean regarding states' refusal to accept a certain number of refugees, which we have seen in the latest years. While Vietnam at the time did little to prevent the exodus, it also took the international community some time to realize the dimension of the humanitarian crisis. However, in that moment, after an intense period of negotiations that was actually mediated by the United Nations, a resettlement framework was established in which several countries participated, including Australia. And one of the key aspects of the response to the Vietnam crisis was the international response, and specifically the creation of specific mechanisms to properly address the humanitarian emergency by establishing these resettlement mechanisms and granting those individuals the status of refugees. Although controversial at the time, as there were some claims that there was not a proper assessment of Indo-Chinese claims and they would be labeled as economic migrants and sent back to Vietnam. What we see nowadays is a paradigm shift from these Indochina boat people to the concept of irregular maritime migration. As today's seaborne migrants are increasingly perceived as a globalized threat, as Amy Noel was claiming and saying, that it led then to this growing securitization and externalization of the European policies in terms of migration management, right? And this conceptualization of migration as a globalized threat to states' internal security, and not only to states' internal security, but also also to the European identities or even to the Western society lifestyles. And in the end, this has led to a growing securitization of irregular migration and the adoption of ever more restrictive policies on the European side, as we have been talking throughout the morning, right? Focusing on responses, what we have seen over the last years is that the debate on border management has thrived with the increase in boat migrants crossing the Mediterranean Sea, particularly since 2013. This has spurred a discussion between the humanitarian and the securitarian challenge in the end, right, at the EU's borders, and the dilemma of how to safeguard internal security while preventing the loss of human lives at sea. The development of a joint policy to manage the EU's external borders is one of the key elements of and a key component in the area of freedom, security, and justice, given the importance of border management for the European Union in terms of protecting and guaranteeing internal security. And in that sense, and I quote the EU, it considers that border control should help to combat, and they use the concept of illegal immigration, another concept that fortunately since 2015 has been omitted from the European Union documents and changed to the concept of irregular migration, given the fact that the concept of illegal migration actually criminalizes on the first hand migrants themselves, right? And going back to the quote, so border control should help to combat illegal immigration and trafficking in human beings and to prevent any threat to the member states' internal security, public policy, public health, and international relations, end of quotation. So in this sense, what we see is that the EU has adopted this concept of integrated border management, IBM, as a nexus to encourage cooperation between member states' agencies responsible for border management and monitoring. And through the adoption of this common approach, the EU has developed a set of technological tools of control and surveillance in order to facilitate the monitoring of irregular cross-border movements. The EU focuses on border surveillance as a critical dimension to better manage migration flows, and that is very clearly identified in the 2015 European Migration Agenda. And the development of sophisticated surveillance tools and information exchange systems helps secure the frontier and detect potential risks. So border surveillance technologies work towards improving the situational awareness picture at the sea border. However, the unregulated use of the systems might turn them into instruments of growing exclusion. The management of human mobility at sea has become increasingly more technological. It is based on a set of high-tech devices such as computers, scans, radars, and other IT instruments operated by a network of highly skilled agents. Actually, these technologies work towards facilitating the deployment of SAR missions, for instance, right, and complying with these international principles. And they often have an early warning character, despite these exclusionary dimensions that we have just referred to. Another associated response has been to focus on traffickers, rather than on creating new legal channels, as we have seen before, as a critical dimension, actually, right, for refugees and migrants. In this sense, following the humanitarian tragedies of 2015, the European Commission adopted the naval operations, EUNAVFOR Med Operation Sophia, that has now been replaced by Operation Irini, that through the identification of smugglers' networks and patrol of international waters aim to research and seize suspected vessels at sea. I will not go into detail on the development of these missions, nor focus on the establishment of SAR missions in the Mediterranean, but I would like to highlight their importance as part of the response adopted by the EU to manage seaborne migration in the Mediterranean, and also regarding the challenges they arise, particularly in terms of human rights protection and safeguarding. As some concluding remarks, I would like to highlight the many challenges that seaborne migration places to maritime security and to human security. It is sad and very sad to see that despite past experiences, such as this example that I used of the Indochina crisis, and the existence of a global compact for safe and orderly migration, which Amanda has just brought up, the EU and the international community are still not able to create a set of mechanisms to avoid these humanitarian emergencies, given, of course, states' personal interests prevalence over the adoption of mechanisms of cooperation. A good example were the resettlement schemes adopted for the Indo-Chinese population at an international scale. Furthermore, we see how the EU strategy to manage maritime irregular migration is mainly focused on the dimension of border management. This has been the primary axis of action. Through the deployment of specific operations, of course, with a SAR character, and the development of new technologies to facilitate early detection. Moreover, rather than addressing the safeguarding of individuals, human security at sea, and the creation of new legal channels, its response has placed a special focus on the fight against smugglers, one of the many layers of this phenomenon. So by adopting a human security approach to migration at the sea, we would privilege the security and the safety of individuals based on the understanding that the security needs of the people are different from the security needs of the state, and therefore they need to be addressed directly. So a paradigm shift is needed to address migration in the maritime context by the international community and national states. How can this be done? Well, I actually, in my research, I've proposed the development of an assortment of minimum standards that include legal, political, and social standards regarding irregular migration to ensure that migrants in vulnerable situations are entitled minimum protection to safeguard their dignity while maintaining a strategy of regulated migration movements, in line with the Global Compact on Migration, which gives us the guidelines for action. So I would end up on this point and look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susanna, for exploring in depth the relationship we have seen between migration management, human security, maritime security, with this specific focus on the Mediterranean. And on the one hand, looking at the threat, the vulnerability of refugees, migrants, and on the other hand, of course, the role and the major policies adopted by the European Union. So now we have more or less half an hour for the Q&A session. We have, thank you very much for this excellent panel, because it was very timing and with very challenging presentations. We have already some questions and some comments from the public. So I start reading the first one. That is a general question, I guess. Ines is asking, considering practices like the occasional criminalization of those who attempt to help migrants and asylum seekers by some EU member states, do you feel that there is a growing securitization tendency in the EU regarding areas like border control or the policy field of migration? Would you say that the European Commission's narrative on the protection and promotion of the European way of life contributes to a potential exclusion, othering of migrants and asylum seekers? This is the first question. What do you prefer? We have other question. Do you want to start with the first one, or you prefer to have a few questions? It's up to you. What do you... So maybe we can start with this one. I don't know if you want to change the order, starting from Susanna.
I can give my perspective if you want, and I'll give the floor. Okay, I actually consider that there has been a growing securitization of migration in the EU. Specifically, although there are several studies from, well, the beginning of the 21st century, I would say, already claiming this growing securitization, given the fact that migration is a topic that is always within the field of security and justice and the space of this area of freedom and security of the EU, right? And the policies have been developed alongside one another. However, what we have seen is that with the 2015 migration crisis, I prefer always to call it a management crisis or a humanitarian crisis rather than a migration crisis in itself. But the EU started adopting and started following this and checking the points in terms of securitization. If we look at securitization theory, we see that given the emergency, the humanitarian emergency in the Mediterranean, the EU takes the lead and adopts the migration agenda of 2015 with a set of specific urgent measures, which is one of the key elements when we talk about securitization, is that a specific phenomenon is understood and conceived as a threat to security, which leads to its to the adoption of urgent measures. In this sense, we had the adoption of these naval operations, for instance, and a set of all other initiatives. And we also see alongside a growing discourse from policy leaders and specifically the leaders of some European member states, leading to this, this conceptualization of migration. And we have seen recently with the case of Ceuta as this moments of migratory pressure, conceiving them as an invasion and a challenge to the internal security, right? And we see these growing security discourses from policy leaders on that sense. And another element, apart from these courses, these speech acts, is in terms of acceptance by the audience. And we have seen this acceptance in the emergence of these populist parties with a growing anti-migration speech, which in several countries and across the European territory, people are validating and supporting ever more. So in this sense, we have all the elements gathered towards this growing securitization of migration, which has translated in the end with a growing focus in terms of border management policies and a set of strategies, as Amy and Amanda have addressed, regarding the relations in terms of with third countries, right? And I don't want to go any further just to leave them in the room, but I do agree that we have seen this securitization over the last years.
Thank you very much, Susanna. Amanda?
Yes, I agree with Susanna that we've seen the increasing securitization of EU migration policies. Not only, I mean, we see it more when you look at the external dimension, which Amy mentioned in her presentation, but also within the EU in selected member states, especially the border, the coastal states, you see a lot more the increasing pressure that has led to this focus on securitization. Again, like she said, you see it in the narratives. You also see it in the diagrams, in the images, pictorially displayed for people. And like Emmanuel equally said, it looks like all the migrants in Africa are on boats heading towards Europe, which is not the situation, but this is what you hear in the policy dialogue, and this is what you see also in the media and in the discussions, and this has led increasingly to some sort of fear and some sort of response in terms of securitizing or taking measures that amount to securitization of migration within Europe. Again, speaking about migration in the same discussions as relates to the internal security of Europe, speaking of migration in forums that or looking at the issues of smuggling of persons, also the same discussions with smuggling of arms or drug smuggling and related discussions. I think these are things that have increasingly switched the focus also from looking and taking a humanitarian and human rights approach of migration issues towards focusing more on securitization. And what we see is that the focus on security issues is being upheld to the detriment of the human rights of migrants. So I think that this is one of the things that really needs to come out in the discussions on migration. And when we look at the whole issue around promoting a European way of life, I mean, that discussion was initially very very critical, and I think that it's now tending more towards having an inclusive society, looking more at how to support and facilitate integration of migrants within Europe into the communities, into their host communities. And so it's more about now looking at ways of facilitating integration, and also some discussions around diaspora engagement are coming up in when it comes to looking at that perspective of promoting a European way of life. So I'm not sure it's quite exclusive, but initially the discussions were quite critical there. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Amanda. Jaime, please.
Yeah, sure. I think on the point, on the point of whether or not there's a growing securitization tendency, I think that was the key thesis of my presentation. But one of the trickle-down effects of that is that you're starting to see more securitization measures within the continent, the African continent, and that there's like no question that that's influenced by European objectives. So there's, stories of, like Maasai herders who have, been nomadic for millennium or centuries, who are being asked for passports and asked for IDs at border crossings. And that's one of the trickle down effects. So you have some of the more restrictive countries like South Africa, who tried, at the beginning of COVID, tried to build a 40-kilometer fence, like they tried to build a wall, and that wasn't something that they've ever tried before. So it ended up sort of parts of it were being torn down and stolen before it was even finished. So it was a terrible, expensive idea from the very beginning. But these are influences that are coming from the outside, and there's a trickle-down effect of this, of having these borders and these controls and these guards in places that there weren't. And also the categorization, I think this starts to speak to the second question. Historically, there's been sort of more of a blurred line between what counts as irregular and regular. The refugee conventions on the continent are prima facie recognition. So you don't arrive and apply for asylum, you arrive and you're accepted as a refugee. And yeah, that was, the AU's refugee convention is that way. So But again, as you're starting to see, I think as not just securitization, but criminalization of migration, I think plays a factor, a major factor in othering. You're seeing a real reduction in ways and legal pathways that people are able to get somewhere, and that turns people into criminals when that's not the intent. I think it was really interesting, and one of Amanda's points was that we're piloting legal pathways among continental partners who have been, neighbors since the beginning of time. So it's interesting that we're speaking about piloting legal pathways. Like, what have we been doing since humanity started? So I think, yeah, the point of criminalizing people who are trying to move really plays a factor in that othering.
Thank you very much, Jaime. So we have another question by Antonio Castro. Is there in those various layers of cooperation between Africa and Europe one that focus on the brain drain matter? Some decades ago, it was the buzzword, but I have not seen so much comment on this at the present. Do you want to start, Amanda?
Yes, I think when we look at the issue of brain gain or brain drain, it's subsumed now in the discussions on migration and development. And like we said, like I said initially, the focus of the EU has been on migration and development from the perspective that migration leads to or contributes to positive development outcomes for African countries. And so the focus now is not so much on brain drain, noting, of course, that there are situations where this might occur, but the idea is to have policies that can balance out the brain drain with skills transfer and also looking at diaspora engagement, then the gains for countries of origin of these migrants become a bit more pronounced. And so based on that, the focus has been on looking at ways to encourage skills transfer through diaspora engagement, also encouraging ways for facilitating remittances, and not only looking at the financial aspects of remittances, but also social remittances coming into countries of origin through facilitated channels. And I think that given this discussion, then the focus is not so much on brain drain, but on policies that can ensure that the benefits of migration are felt by the communities and countries of origin. I think another thing to point out also, and I think Emily also mentioned this in her discussion, is the fact that with the high unemployment rate in most African countries, there is also there's a possibility for skills of these migrants to be better used elsewhere than in their countries of origin. And so also there's a possibility for migrants to gain better skills that can contribute to the development of their countries of origin. And so the idea is to see how to, through migration, enable people to move in regular ways and also return back to their countries of origin at some point in their migration trajectory, when they decide to return to their countries of origin, to contribute to the development, or if they decide for a limited period to contribute to development of their countries of origin. There are several programs that are equally being supported through diaspora engagement mechanisms. So the focus now is really on diaspora engagement and facilitating return of remittances. And that's why the discussion on brain drain is not so much in focus anymore.
Thank you, Amanda. Jaime?
Yeah, sure. I'm not as much as a policy buff as Amanda is, definitely. But I do, when the AU issued a common position, on the Global Compact for Migration, and it wasn't terribly long, but in the top 3 points was a firm statement about brain drain and how they wanted to see the Global Compact on migration to include and to address the brain drain. So I think And it was, if I remember, it was worded so strongly that I started laughing. Like it was, you couldn't believe it was like a policy document. And so I think some of the feelings on the continent are still quite strong about it. But that's all I'll say.
Thank you, Anne. Susanna?
I would just like to say more than on brain drain, possible and focusing on some of the ideas that all of us have already highlighted today, is also possible, well, the need for these legal channels, because actually we have to take into account how Europe itself needs migrants. Actually, despite all our restrictive and ever more coercive policies, we need, talking about we as Europeans, we need migration. And that is for a fact. We are, if we think about demographics, we are talking an ever more aging population and this need of labor in all our European markets. So I think this very much stressed possible complementaries that should be created between both continents. Also, as Amanda was highlighting, stressing this this dimension in terms of skill gaining and competence, etc. And that would be it.
Thank you very much, Susanna. So the next one is by Carlos Colasso. The first is a comment saying that both Jaime and Amanda produce great overviews of the multiple issues and complexity involved with Africa-Europe migration flows. Setting the record straight with facts and figures is the essence from the outset. So thank you. And the question is a general one. Which in your view would be the best approach the EU should adopt to tackle these migratory pressures, large or small, at any one time? Who wants to start?
I can start. I guess my question would be, yeah, what migratory pressures? But anyways, yeah, I think that the focus on migratory pressures, at least Amy has tried to dispel that in her initial discussion, that when she started with the facts and figures and showing that most of the migration, especially between or African migration, is mostly intercontinental, and looking also at the numbers of migrants between Europe and Africa, and showing that it's not all as it's made to look like in the pictures and in the news media and policy discussions with a host of African migrants heading towards Europe. That's definitely not the situation. And so I think if we look at what migration policy is trying to address, it's trying to address issues that should be dealt with by other policies. It's trying to address issues that should be dealt with by labor policy. It's trying to address issues that should be dealt with by integration and everything. But migration is now being looked at as the silver bullet, and migration is not the silver bullet to address some of these issues. Yes, there might be issues relating to security, but they should be addressed by security policies, and migration policies should address issues relating to migration, which, if we come to the discussions, like has been mentioned by Susanna, the main issue here is that Europe does need migrants for specific sectors. And so the idea should be to try to see how to facilitate the movement of people into Europe to work in these specific sectors. Also, how to address certain challenges that they might face while working in these sectors, and how to facilitate their return if and when they do decide to return to their countries of origin. Of course, the discussion on secular migration has also been brought to the forefront, that when there is a more open secular migration policy, there is a lower tendency for migrants to settle, because they always want to return back to their countries of origin and have a possibility of coming back to the country of destination, especially if it relates to work purposes. Sorry, interpreters, I realize I'm talking a bit fast, so I'll slow down. Especially as it relates to migrating for employment purposes. So I think the idea here should be the issues that need to be addressed by different sectorial policies should be addressed within these sectors, and migration policy should not be used as a silver bullet. But when it comes to the issues of migration, then identify the areas where migration is definitely needed to support the development of certain key sectors. And then also have, in my opinion, open secular migration policies would be the best way to go, and not secular migration in the case of what we're seeing in the pilots, where it has to do with 1 year or 3 months, because, sorry, 1 year or 3 years, because that's definitely not the way to go when people are uprooting their lives to work in certain host countries, but looking more at a long-term solutions.
Thank you very much. Susanna, Jaime, do you want to add anything to this?
I would just like to add to and stress these ideas from Amanda, because I think it is very important, more than and this so-called migration crisis. We are talking more about, even now, about Ceuta. No, the news were there is a migration crisis in Ceuta. No, there is a lack of capacity to manage and to address these situations in specific moments of greater stress. So to say, because the mechanisms and the policies developed and set up in or are not in place or are not adequate to face certain and specific moments of greater stress or pressure. And just in that sense, I think it is very important what Amanda said, that specific policies should be created in terms of migration itself, focusing on these legal channels, for instance, and others key dimensions relating to integration, etc., etc. And when we are talking about security, we are talking about security and separate it. Otherwise, migration policies nowadays at the EU, as Amy just stressed, are highly based on this growing criminalization of migration, which leads to a more securitarian approach, right? So we have to get out of that narrative in order to be able to adopt more coherent policies, so to say.
Yeah, and I would sort of echo the same. I think one of the most important parts of like a robust and complete migration management program is visa liberalization. So if there's no legal pathways for people to get anywhere, that's how you come up with, that's a key driver to these migratory pressures. And those have really been taken off the table and are now being used to leverage cooperation on the externalization and the securitization aspects. So I think that, as well as I would highlight refugee resettlement. So, you know, there's now over 80 million refugees and displaced people on the continent. And in 2020, 22,700 were selected for resettlement. And I think it's about 7,000 went to Europe. So, you know, refugee resettlement, like the pressure within Africa, there's 26 million refugees and displaced people being hosted within the continent, and those people have nowhere to go. You know, the prospects for resettlement are almost, you know, they're literally negligible. And that's also a driver for onward migration, is that people have nowhere to go and nowhere to get there. So, and those pathways seem to be closing as well, and they're tiny. So I think, yeah, proper migration management means looking at all of these windows and not leveraging some against the other, not lumping them together, and really, you know, taking stock of where the world is right now, not just the continent.
Thank you very much, Jaime. So maybe I would conclude with the last question by Joana Lopes. Do you believe that a policy for migration can be implemented at UN level, in particular taking into account the differences between the member states, demography, economies, political view? And she's asking in particular about the issue of the refugee in the Mediterranean, and then we connect it, of course, on what is happening right now in Ceuta.
I mean, if I'll go first on this, because well, I think one of my key points is that obviously this issue is an internal EU issue, and especially when it comes to Africa, where the numbers just don't stack up. So all of the money, all of the pressure, everything headed towards Africa for a really quite small, ultimately, number of people. And it's clearly like the issue of returns is one of the only really unifying things within the EU. And it's clear that work needs to be done to get those 27 member states to agree. But that's an internal political issue. And my key point is that it's coming at the expense of Africa and of African migration. And I think that more of us should be waving the red flags when it comes to that.
I can go now. Adding to that, I think it is, and it is very critical, and it just reminded me that the idea that in the end, what has been done so far at the EU in terms of migration policy overall, both internal and external, is based on a set of minimum denominators that states are willing to accept. Because when we talk about migration, and this is a key issue in terms of policies, is that we are talking about an issue, an area that is that comes to the core of national sovereignty, right? In which member states are unwilling to give as much power as they could to the EU, right? And this leads then to this set of strategies and policies that are based on minimum denominators among all. If we can start with higher standards, but the negotiations will then just come to these minimums that states are willing to negotiate. And in that sense, and in line with Amy, what she just said now, that who is suffering from this in the end is Africa and African migrants. And we see, and just relating to the Ceuta situation nowadays, and we see this greater dependence of the EU in specific states, and it goes back to all of our presentations this morning, in some states, specifically Turkey and Morocco now, and how dependent the EU is from these states in terms of migration management. So this is one of the key issues that the EU has to address, and it is very well, it depends on states' willingness also in order to move forward and to develop more coherent policies in that sense.
Yeah, if I could just add something, I'd like to focus again on this, on the reducing standards when it comes to protection of human rights. And what we see in my presentation, I tried to give an overview of the engagements between European and African countries. And we see that there's a lot of cooperation on the bilateral level, but also at the regional and continental level. And I think there is safety in moving with the cooperation at the level of the EU, because much as it is, there are issues that should be definitely addressed, but there is a lower tendency to see the fast reduction in respect for human rights, that unlike what you see when it's bilateral cooperation. Bilateral cooperation really overrides, and if there are several examples, Niger could be the best worst case scenario. There are several examples on the continent where you see bilateral cooperation completely overriding the respect to human rights, international agreed human rights. And I think that this is something that we need to keep this caveat at the back of our minds, because there are certain things that, I mean, yeah, the EU is cooperating with Libya, but there are also certain policy thresholds that will not cannot be crossed, but can easily be crossed when it's just bilateral cooperation. So there needs to be that balance there. And of course, there is a discussion also of what the EU can offer in terms of incentives for cooperating with third countries or African countries in this case, where most of the jurisdiction for that falls within the competence of the states and not the competence of the EU. So for example, talking about legal mobility partnerships, the states have to be the ones to come up with the identified sectors and identified ways because that mandate falls within the jurisdiction of the state. Also looking at certain examples when it comes to asylum and the differences within the state. So definitely the EU needs to address these issues when it comes to its internal migration policy and not necessarily focus so much, which is what Emmanuel is saying, focus so much on the external migration policies. But this is what we see now. We see now, even with the new Asylum and Migration Pact, that the focus is more on the external migration policy because there cannot be any agreement so far in terms of the internal migration policy. So don't flip it the other way around. Focus on getting the internal migration policies correct and agreeing on, even if it's going to be minimum standards, but focus on agreeing on those minimum standards within the internal migration policies, and then now decide on how you want to implement the external migration policies. But also knowing that if we focus too much on this bilateral level, then we'll really see a race to the bottom when it comes to human rights.
Thank you very much, Amandas. Thank you for this very excellent discussion. We will have more questions, but we need to move to the next panel entitled Climate Change and Human Security. Thank you again, Jaime, Amanda, and Susanna.
Thank you.
Thank you very much to the four of you for this very, very enticing panel. As Professor Julian just mentioned, this concludes our panel on migrations and human security. And so on behalf of both the Center for International Studies and the National Defense Institute, thank you very much for being this morning with us. Thank you very much. And this concludes our panel on climate change and human security. And I want to reinforce Inês' work and thank you all, the four of you, for this very last panel in the morning. I believe we were very fortunate to count on your input on this specific topic. And I think it brought the conference to the very end with a very insightful discussion on the implications of climate change. So thank you very much on behalf of the Center for International Studies and the National Defense Institute. But as Inês mentioned, yet again, this also means we have to go straight to the very final stages of our conference. We keep running out of time, unfortunately. And this very final moment of our conference, as mentioned before, will be taking place in Portuguese. So, permitam-me por isso recordar uma última vez que muito embora esta sessão vá decorrer integralmente em língua portuguesa, será, no entanto, proporcionada a opção de tradução simultânea em inglês, bastando para isso clicar em interpretação na barra inferior do lado direito e clicar de seguida no idioma que deseja ouvir. De forma opcional, se desejar ouvir apenas a respectiva tradução, clique em silenciar áudio original. To our English speakers, we remind you again that this session will take place entirely in Portuguese, but that the option of simultaneous translation to English will be provided as well. And in order to benefit from it, simply click on the interpretation button in the lower right-hand bar of your Zoom screen, and then click on the language you want to hear. Additionally, if you want to hear only the respective translation, click on Mute Original Audio. Este momento de encerramento consistirá, assim, de uma segunda intervenção de fundo da nossa conferência, a cargo da doutora Rita Laranjinha, enquanto keynote speaker convidada, que creio que já se encontra também entre nós. Se não estou em erro, sim, exatamente. E nesse sentido, e sem mais demoras, permita-me que faça as devidas apresentações. A doutora Rita Laranjinha é licenciada em Relações Internacionais pela Universidade de Lisboa e em Estudos Europeus, Ciência Política e Administração pelo Colégio da Europa, em Bruges. Foi aceita na carreira diplomática em 1996 e entre os seus diversos cargos neste âmbito destacam-se os seguintes: assessora do Secretário de Estado dos Assuntos Europeus, assessora do Ministro dos Negócios Estrangeiros e chefe de gabinete do Ministro dos Negócios Estrangeiros. Entre agosto de 2011 e junho de 2012 foi chefe de departamento para organizações multilaterais da Direção-Geral de Política Externa. Nos 2 anos seguintes foi subchefe da missão diplomática portuguesa em Luanda. Em 2015 foi nomeada diretora-geral adjunta de Política Externa, encarregue das relações com a África e Américas, tendo sido no mesmo ano promovida a ministra plenipotenciária. De novembro de 2015 a agosto de 2018 foi novamente chefe de gabinete do ministro dos Estrangeiros e em 2018 foi nomeada embaixadora de Portugal na Dinamarca e em 2019 para a Lituânia não residente. Em dezembro de 2020 foi nomeada diretora-geral para a África no Serviço Europeu de Ação Externa, cargo que ocupa atualmente. Relembramos os nossos participantes também que ainda será possível um brevíssimo período de perguntas e respostas a seguir, a razão pela qual pedíamos que eventuais questões fossem colocadas por escrito no chat de forma atempada. Isto dito, doutora Rita Laranjinha, muito obrigado pela sua disponibilidade e a sua participação esta manhã. Tem então a palavra. Muito obrigado.
Muito obrigada. Obrigada pelo convite também. A pergunta da praxe é se me ouvem bem, não é? Temos sempre esta...
Ouvimos sim, obrigado.
Obrigada. Então queria agradecer o ISCTE, agradecer ao Instituto de Defesa Nacional por me terem convidado. Dizer não constitui algum valor acrescentado em relação ao que já tiveram a oportunidade de debater ontem e hoje. Como também já disse, estarei, claro, disponível para um período de perguntas e respostas, portanto vou tentar não me alongar demasiado na minha exposição e ainda a título introdutório queria só dizer que, enfim, tenho particular prazer em vir participar nesta conferência, por se tratar, claro, do ISCTE, se tratar do Instituto de Defesa Nacional, instituições de muito prestígio, mas também confesso por ser a segunda keynote speaker desta conferência e o primeiro ter sido o professor Carlos Lopes, e que é uma pessoa cujo trabalho eu muito admiro e que sigo com grande interesse nestas minhas novas funções. E parece-me que é muito importante esta participação do professor Carlos Lopes na vossa conferência, porque a tendência que me parece infelizmente ainda persistir é que nós europeus temos a tendência para discutir os problemas de África entre nós, em formatos que são excessivamente eurocêntricos, e é essencial que os nossos debates sobre a África se alarguem a participantes africanos e que os centros de investigação e de estudos das questões internacionais trabalhem cada vez mais com os seus congéneres africanos, para que, enfim, que haja realmente uma percepção do que é que os africanos pensam sobre o seu futuro, quais é que são as suas perspectivas sobre os problemas com que se confrontam, e portanto, espero que o Instituto de Defesa Nacional e que o ISCTE façam disso uma prática e que ajudem nesta construção de redes entre centros de investigação europeus e africanos, que é essencial. Muito também porque uma das dificuldades que existe na relação entre a União Europeia e a África é exatamente o facto de nós europeus continuarmos a ter a tendência de ler muito a realidade africana sob os nossos próprios prismas e com os nossos parâmetros, e esse princípio é óbvio que tem que ser alterado. Temos que aprender a ouvir o que nos dizem, temos que aprender a interpretar os silêncios, temos que aprender a fazer uma leitura diferente dos tempos, dos timings, que são obviamente diferentes na Europa e em África. E só assim é que eu penso que será possível ultrapassar alguns mal-entendidos que ainda existem na relação entre a Europa, a União Europeia e a União Africana, entre os países europeus e os países africanos. Penso-me que isto que é essencial. terminando esta introdução, queria talvez explicar um bocadinho em que é que consiste o meu lugar, porque isto de Diretora-Geral para a África do Serviço Europeu da Ação Externa pode parecer um bocadinho abstrato, e portanto para perceberem, portanto o Serviço Europeu da Ação Externa é no fundo o Serviço Diplomático Europeu, acho que podemos simplificando dizer que é o Ministério dos Negócios Estrangeiros da União Europeia, e portanto eu tutelo aqui uma equipa em Bruxelas de cerca de 70 funcionários e tenho a supervisão de 46 delegações da União Europeia em África. Ou seja, a União Europeia está presente em praticamente todos os países da África subsaariana, com exceção de São Tomé e Príncipe, da Guiné Equatorial, das Seychelles e das Comores. E em Addis tem 2 representações, porque tem o que nós chamamos uma representação bilateral, portanto junto do governo etíope, e tem uma representação junto da União Africana. Portanto, tem, enfim, esta artilharia distribuída por todo o continente africano, é o serviço diplomático com uma presença mais forte em África do que qualquer outro país europeu. Além disso, aqui o Serviço Europeu tem que se articular naturalmente com a Comissão, com o Conselho, nomeadamente na formação de negócios estrangeiros, com o Presidente do Parlamento Europeu, o Presidente do Conselho Europeu e também com o Parlamento Europeu, visto que somos chamados várias vezes a ir ao Parlamento Europeu para explicar as posições que são assumidas pela União Europeia. Articulamos-nos também com os representantes especiais para o Corno da África e para o Sahel, portanto que têm equipas próprias e com as quais nós trabalhamos muito de perto. Temos obviamente que fazer uma articulação permanente com os 27 Estados-membros, visto que a política não é a política do Serviço Europeu da Ação Externa, é a política da União Europeia e portanto as posições dos Estados-membros é essencial que sejam tidas em conta. E obviamente depois temos que ter uma interação permanente com os nossos parceiros africanos. Portanto é um trabalho complexo, mas também é um trabalho, claro, obviamente que nos dá imensas oportunidades, visto que temos a possibilidade de usar todas as sinergias entre estes diferentes instrumentos e estes diferentes atores que estão à nossa disposição. Eu fui antes embaixadora de Portugal na Dinamarca, era um bocadinho mais tranquilo, devo dizer, mas enfim, é um lugar é um privilégio ter sido nomeada para este lugar. Portanto, eu estou aqui num posto de observação que é obviamente e de ação privilegiado, no que diz respeito à observação da realidade da relação entre a União Europeia e a África e portanto gostava de partilhar convosco algumas informações, algumas reflexões sobre a relação especificamente no que diz respeito às questões de segurança e desenvolvimento, que é o tema principal desta conferência. E primeiro queria dizer algo que nós, enfim, portugueses gostamos de dizer, mas que eu agora como funcionária europeia posso dizer com mais autoridade, que é o facto de realmente o que para nós sempre foi uma evidência de que as relações com a União Europeia tinham que estar no centro dos interesses da política externa europeia, hoje em dia é um dado adquirido e para isso muito contribuíram os esforços que foram feitos pela diplomacia portuguesa e isso é aqui amplamente reconhecido e continua a ser verdade que Portugal tem um conhecimento particular dos dossiês africanos e é importante que a diplomacia portuguesa continua a investir o mais possível na relação com a África e obviamente que os centros de estudos e de investigação portugueses continuem a analisar a realidade africana porque isso é obviamente também essencial. Portanto, hoje em dia é um dado adquirido que a relação com a África é essencial, que temos que trabalhar cada vez mais no que diz respeito às questões do multilateralismo, da paz, da segurança, da estabilidade, obviamente do desenvolvimento sustentável e inclusivo, do crescimento económico sustentável também. O facto disto hoje ser um dado adquirido ficou muito expresso na decisão que a Presidente da Comissão Europeia tomou quando tomou posse de fazer a sua primeira visita com os seus colegas da Comissão a Addis Abeba para se encontrar com a Comissão da União Africana. As relações fazem-se de momentos simbólicos e esse foi obviamente um momento de um grande simbolismo e que deu bem o mote de uma das prioridades da nova Comissão Europeia e o que depois ficou também refletido no ano passado pelo facto de ter sido aprovada uma comunicação conjunta sobre as relações com a África, para uma parceria com a África e depois serem adoptadas conclusões do Conselho e do Conselho Europeu também sobre a relação com a África. E portanto nós no pré-pandemia tinham sido definidas 5 parcerias que a União Europeia considerava que eram áreas prioritárias para ajudar os africanos a ultrapassar os desafios com que se confrontavam e com que ainda se confrontam. As 5 parcerias sobre a transição ecológica e o acesso à energia, a parceria sobre a transformação digital, a parceria sobre o crescimento sustentável e a criação de emprego, a parceria para a paz, segurança e governação e a parceria para a migração e mobilidade. Todas elas, obviamente, com impacto nas questões de desenvolvimento e de segurança. Portanto, quando a União Europeia depois se preparava para começar a dialogar com os parceiros africanos sobre estas propostas, aconteceu o Covid enfim, as prioridades, estas áreas continuaram a ser obviamente essenciais, mas é verdade que depois a relação com a África se concentrou muito nas questões do combate à pandemia. Há quem diga que o facto de não ter sido possível no ano passado, como tinha sido proposto, realizar a reunião ministerial entre a União Europeia e os países africanos e ter-se realizado a cimeira que a presidência portuguesa gostaria de ter promovido, constituíram um entrave no nosso relacionamento, mas a verdade é que muito foi feito ao longo deste ano em relação no que diz respeito à relação com a África e os números são muito expressivos, 40,5 mil milhões de euros que a União Europeia e os Estados-membros neste novo conceito do Team Europe disponibilizaram para a luta contra a pandemia, para respostas de emergência e saúde imediata, para necessidades humanitárias, o facto da União Europeia ter estado sempre na vanguarda da resposta multilateral do acesso às vacinas, no quadro do mecanismo COVAX, 2,47 mil milhões de euros de contribuição até à data, depois uma contribuição adicional de 100 milhões de euros em ajuda humanitária para as campanhas de vacinação em África e para os centros africanos de controle e prevenção de doenças. Muito recentemente na Conferência de Paris, um novo empenho esta conferência promovida pelo Presidente Macron de apoio às economias africanas, outra vez a Presidente da Comissão, o Presidente do Conselho Europeu a reiterarem o apoio para as economias africanas e especificamente novas iniciativas de apoio às PMEs africanas, ao desenvolvimento da capacidade de produção de vacinas em África. E depois toda a ação que tem sido desenvolvida pela União Europeia no que diz respeito à suspensão do serviço da dívida, o que diz respeito à reestruturação da dívida, o que diz respeito à promoção da emissão de direitos especiais de saque do FMI, portanto tudo isso tem sido uma constante na ação da União Europeia nos últimos anos, nos últimos meses, portanto desde março do ano passado. Portanto, isto pareceu-me que era também importante referir, porque, enfim, nós sabemos que ninguém está seguro enquanto nem todos estivermos seguros, portanto, isto também tem o seu impacto em questões de segurança e tem, obviamente, impacto nas questões de desenvolvimento, porque sabemos bem que pela primeira vez os números sobre o crescimento económico em África são negativos, ou foram negativos no ano passado, e infelizmente os dados sobre de novo o crescimento dos níveis de pobreza muito preocupantes em África, e portanto esta ação da União Europeia de apoio, por um lado para ajudar a estancar a pandemia e por outro para ajudar a que sejam criadas as condições para um build back better das economias africanas, me pareceu essencial fazer esta ação. Mas recentrando depois mais especificamente nas questões de segurança e desenvolvimento, sobre as quais a União Europeia se tem, enfim, tem muito concentrado em muita sua ação. No teatro africano, gostava de salientar também a importância da ação que tem sido desenvolvida nesse domínio e, como sabem, em teatros de operação muito diferentes em África, visto que a União Europeia tem missões no Sahel, no Corno da África, na RCA, na Somália, portanto está ativa em não sei números de crises no continente africano. Através do Fundo de Apoio à Paz, em 16 anos foram disponibilizados 3,15 bilhões de euros. Neste momento há 10 missões de política comum de segurança e defesa que estão deployed, nunca sei a palavra certa em português, no continente africano, 2.000 soldados europeus, polícias e funcionários públicos que apoiam, aconselham, treinam 30.000 militares, polícias e funcionários judiciais africanos. Portanto, esta é a dimensão das missões que estão atualmente no terreno. Há programas, além disso, da União Africana em cerca de 30 países que apoiam a resolução e a prevenção de conflitos. E, portanto, isto é uma ação que é já muito, enfim, já muito desenvolvida, mas que, obviamente, precisa de ser ainda melhor estruturada, precisa de ser ainda, ter um alcance ainda mais estratégico. E uma das decisões que foi recentemente adotada de criação do Fundo Europeu para a Paz, o EPF, é um fator, enfim, que pensamos que pode ajudar a preencher uma lacuna que tem existido neste apoio à promoção da segurança nos países africanos, e que tem a ver com o facto de que até agora a União Europeia podia treinar as forças armadas de países terceiros, mas não os podia equipar, e a facilidade, este Fundo Europeu para a Paz, ou esta Facilidade Europeia para a Paz, vai permitir ultrapassar essa limitação. Além disso, estamos determinados em aproveitar o novo dinamismo da nova Comissão Europeia da União Africana para dar um avanço na implementação do memorando de entendimento que existe entre a União Africana e a União Europeia sobre paz e segurança. Eu tive já em Addis Abeba uma longuíssima reunião com o novo comissário para as questões de paz e segurança e também para os assuntos políticos, o comissário nigeriano Bankole, e vi da sua determinação de muito bem aproveitar todo o apoio que a União Europeia possa dar e que já disponibiliza para apoiar as soluções africanas para os assuntos africanos. Ele, aliás, comentou com graça que este African Solution for African Problems é também a ASAP, portanto, as soon as possible. Portanto, ele fez esta ligação e parece-me que ele realmente tem dinâmica para avançar nesse sentido. Portanto, além desta melhor, enfim, estruturação da nossa ajuda, a União Europeia vai continuar a procurar o melhor possível integrar as questões da boa governação, da democracia, do respeito pelos direitos humanos e do Estado de Direito e da igualdade de género nas políticas de segurança e desenvolvimento. Este é um princípio essencial das nossas ações de segurança e desenvolvimento em África. Temos infelizmente assistido a algum setback, alguns recuos no modelo democrático usado pelos um conjunto de países africanos, mas a verdade é que os indicadores do Afrobarómetro continuam-nos a dizer de forma consistente que os cidadãos africanos apoiam esmagadoramente o modelo democrático de governo e, portanto, pedem uma participação, uma governação mais democrática. Esses são também os nossos princípios e os nossos valores e, portanto, continuaremos a trabalhar nesse sentido, sendo que também essa é a base da arquitetura de governação africana, portanto é também essa a base do trabalho da União Africana e o que está bem expresso na Carta Africana sobre democracia, eleições e governança. Portanto, isso é um ponto sobre o qual nós continuaremos a trabalhar e que vamos pondo em prática em todas as nossas diferentes ações. Outro ponto sobre o qual nós vamos continuar a insistir no desenvolvimento de políticas em África em matérias de paz e segurança e desenvolvimento é a preocupação de cada vez mais ligarmos as intervenções humanitárias, as intervenções na área do desenvolvimento e as ações no âmbito da paz e segurança e, portanto, fazer isto em todo o ciclo de conflitos e de crise. Portanto, esta abordagem integrada de ações diplomáticas, humanitárias, desenvolvimento, paz e segurança. A nossa preocupação é que haja uma combinação equilibrada de ações com perspectivas de curto, médio e longo prazo. E a ação que nós estamos a desenvolver neste momento, que estamos a preparar em Moçambique, está exatamente baseada neste princípio de uma abordagem comprehensive, na qual estamos a preparar o reforço de ações na área humanitária, o apoio às estruturas de promoção do desenvolvimento da província de Cabo Delgado e uma ação de treino de forças militares africanas. Esta política já foi aprovada no Comitê de Política e de Segurança e neste momento está uma missão em Maputo, uma missão da União Europeia a finalizar os os detalhes desta missão de natureza militar. Outro aspecto sobre o qual a União Europeia tem posto muito o enfoque e que foi um dos temas que debateram durante a conferência tem a ver com a questão da migração e da mobilidade e com a importância que a União Europeia quer continuar a dar a parcerias equilibradas, coerentes e abrangentes. Nós consideramos que é essencial que a União Europeia avance, continue a fazer esforços neste sentido e que, obviamente, de acordo com as competências da União Europeia e dos Estados-membros, no respeito do direito internacional e, obviamente, no pleno respeito dos direitos humanos. Tem, portanto, sido desenvolvidas uma série de ações em conjunto com os países africanos que conhecerão os processos de Rabat, de Khartoum, o plano de ação de La Valeta e sendo que a nossa insistência é que procuremos ter sempre uma abordagem positiva às questões da migração e criar uma narrativa que vá para lá deste receio da vaga migratória proveniente do continente africano. E por isso também temos um trabalho permanente com as estruturas da Comissão da União Africana sobre o combate ao tráfico de migrantes e de seres humanos, apoio às estruturas africanas de apoio à migração legal, o trabalho no que diz respeito ao retorno, à readmissão e à reintegração de migrantes, enfim, portanto, toda uma ação que é desenvolvida em estreita articulação com a União Africana e com os países países africanos neste âmbito. Para terminar, é óbvio que tudo isto só faz sentido num contexto mais global, visto que a União Europeia não é o único ator internacional com uma ação em África e sabemos bem que, enfim, que é preciso que a União Europeia encontre o seu lugar também em relação aos diferentes posicionamentos desses outros atores, alguns deles que são obviamente nossos concorrentes, que têm modelos de cooperação, agendas que são muito diferentes das nossas, como a China, como a Rússia, também a Turquia, os países do Golfo que estão muito ativos no Corno da África, e não só com estes países a terem, enfim, uma presença militar cada vez mais enfim, mais consolidada, mas também usarem instrumentos novos nas práticas diplomáticas ou nas práticas, talvez não diplomáticas não seja a palavra certa, mas enfim, nas práticas de conquista de influência, como os instrumentos de desinformação que são cada vez mais sofisticados e que usados de forma cada vez mais abrangente, sobretudo pela Rússia, como bem sabem. Mas também, quer dizer, temos não só que nos distinguir destes atores, também que procurar alinhar-nos com países que nos são like-minded, como o Japão, ou os Estados Unidos, ou a Rússia, ou mesmo com a Índia, mas ao mesmo tempo ainda assim mantermos alguma linha diferenciadora. E, portanto, é preciso encontrar aqui o equilíbrio entre o fazer diferente dos competidores e também não fazer exatamente igual a países que nos são mais próximos e continuar a ter, enfim, uma abordagem o mais integrada possível e, portanto, é tão importante que esta sintonia de ações em matéria de paz e de segurança esteja sempre enfim, perspectivada nas ações da União Europeia. Tudo isto, como eu fui tentando, enfim, sublinhar ao longo da intervenção, é óbvio que tem que se fazer com um trabalho cada vez mais aprofundado e mais em parceria com os países africanos e também com a União Africana e com as comunidades económicas regionais que, como sabem, têm um papel também portanto, importante a jogar em matéria de paz e segurança na decorrência da arquitetura de paz e segurança africana e, portanto, cada vez o nosso trabalho procura ser mais alinhado com estas estruturas também, estando bem conscientes que, enfim, que são estruturas institucionalmente muito menos fortes que a União Europeia e que às vezes têm ainda alguma dificuldade em assumir-se, mas que têm tido um papel fulcral na estabilização de determinadas situações. Por exemplo, ainda, como sabem, ontem à noite houve esta situação, enfim, de instabilidade no Mali e foi a CEDEAO que já hoje se deslocou para o Mali para continuar a fazer o seu trabalho de mediação e portanto é o primeiro recurso, é uma estrutura, é a comunidade económica regional que avança. E isso é obviamente positivo e nós procuramos cada vez mais dar o nosso apoio a essas estruturas. Isto é óbvio que é um trabalho de construção de confiança mas que penso que tem vindo a dar frutos e penso que poderá, enfim, continuar numa senda cada vez mais positiva e cada vez mais integrada. E eu acho que paro aqui porque assim deixamos algum tempo para perguntas e respostas. Obrigada.
Muito obrigado para a Rita por proporcionar esta panorâmica sobre a própria percepção e a posição da União Europeia face às relações com o continente africano e em particular com a União Africana e de facto, infelizmente temos tempo contado, mas gostaríamos ainda assim de rentabilizá-lo o melhor possível e portanto eu sugeria se me permitisse fazer 2 blocos de 2 perguntas para tentar aproveitar melhor também o seu tempo connosco. E estamos a receber, quer inclusive...
Estou a ver aqui no chat, não é? Várias.
E outras que estão a ser enviadas também diretamente, portanto eu tentarei fazer um combo, digamos assim, de algumas perguntas para tentar aproveitar todos os contributos que estão a ser enviados, mas a primeira delas que me foi enviada aqui logo durante a sua intervenção diz respeito, que mencionou que a relação UE-África faz-se de momentos de simbolismo, e mencionou a questão do adiamento da cimeira de alto nível entre a UE e a UA, mas qual seria aqui a dependência da atual relação face a essas mesmas cimeiras para se conseguir desbloquear assuntos na agenda ou gerar novos desenvolvimentos na parceria conjunta? Quão dependente é que a relação está da realização física ou, de alguma forma, deste tipo de momentos de alto nível? E a segunda pergunta, aproveitaria para lhe perguntar, precisamente com relação ao novo acordo de pós-Cotonou, que introduziu um novo modelo de relacionamento, enfim, com as 3 regiões e proporcionando um guarda-chuva comum em termos mais das próprias relações da ACP, mas também proporcionando, de certa forma, um novo enquadramento das relações com o continente africano a este nível. E como veria a evolução deste quadro no médio prazo? Será que não introduz uma maior complexidade institucional no relacionamento com a África, ou crê que tenderá a ser subsumida na parceria UA-UE, permitindo uma maior ênfase específica em África? E, portanto, estas seriam as 2 primeiras perguntas, a questão do adiamento da cimeira e a questão do acordo pós-Cotonou.
Bem, o adiamento da cimeira tem exclusivamente a ver com a questão do Covid, quer dizer, noutros tempos havia dificuldade realmente em voltar a convocar cimeiras, em haver um encontro de vontades, e esse não é de todo o caso, portanto há aqui uma questão de natureza prática que é impossível. Eu estou aqui a olhar para a janela porque estou aqui no Rond-Point Schuman, mesmo no centro de Bruxelas, e quer dizer, e sabemos que, enfim, há Conselho Europeu, mas não tem havido, não é, fisicamente, e portanto as reuniões não se estão a realizar. Mas o que tem acontecido é que, obviamente, os trabalhos continuam a realizar-se e os contactos continuam a ser feitos, e estamos todos uns especialistas em VTCs, uns e outros, mas e mesmo assim tem havido algum número de iniciativas, e entre as quais eu destacaria a iniciativa que foi tomada pela presidência portuguesa de promover em coordenação com o Banco Europeu de Desenvolvimento uma série de Green Talks sobre exatamente a transição energética, com a preocupação de promover um quadro de debate que melhor promovesse um entendimento entre africanos e europeus sobre o interesse comum nesta transição. E esse trabalho foi essencial e é essencial, e portanto pode-se bem aproveitar esta pausa antes da cimeira para iniciativas deste tipo e contactos deste tipo que ajudam a amadurecer, os diferentes temas que estão na agenda bilateral e, como eu dizia inicialmente, em relação aos quais nós às vezes não temos logo a mesma leitura. Eu estive em Addis agora recentemente, e um dos encontros que tive foi com a comissária Josefa Sacco, que é uma comissária de nacionalidade angolana, que foi reconduzida da última comissão para esta. Aliás, foi a comissária mais bem classificada no painel de avaliação que eles fizeram, e que é também a comissária responsável pelas questões do ambiente. Enfim, o discurso que se ouve agora dos responsáveis africanos já é muito diferente daquele que se ouvia há talvez 2 anos atrás, quando a União Europeia, ou há mais, começou a insistir sobre estas questões do Green Deal, porque havia um enorme receio sobre o que é que isso significaria em termos de eventuais de impacto no comércio bilateral e no desenvolvimento dos países africanos. Portanto, enfim, estas pausas nos encontros de alto nível podem também ser aproveitados para promover debates e para ajudar a aproximar posições, e portanto fazer com que a cimeira venha a ser mais bem sucedida e que seja depois mais fácil encontrar um caminho conjunto. A União Africana também estava singularmente numa fase final de anterior comissão, portanto teria provavelmente sido mais difícil para a Comissão da União Africana organizar-se para esta cimeira. Agora já vai estar, quer dizer, plenamente na posse das suas funções, com os comissários em exercício, com o presidente da Comissão Europeia reeleito, enfim, com um enorme apoio dos seus pares, e portanto isso também vai permitir seguramente que estejam mais bem preparados e mais seguros das suas posições e mais uma vez ajudar à eficácia da cimeira. Sobre o acordo de pós-Cotonou, há muito essa inquietação, como é que pós-Cotonou e a parceria entre a União Africana e a União Europeia, como é que vão encaixar umas nas outras, mas nós, se lermos o acordo pós-Cotonou, percebemos que o acordo é um acordo que estabelece uma série não só de princípios que enquadram a relação, mas também que identifica uma série de áreas, áreas nas quais a cooperação, em que a África e a Europa concordam que devem trabalhar em conjunto. E, portanto, o trabalho que depois a cimeira, ou os processos das cimeiras vão fazendo, no fundo, é pôr em prática alguns pôr em prática os princípios, porque os princípios e os valores são sempre subjacentes à relação, mas, por outro lado, também permitir um trabalho mais específico entre algumas das áreas que foram identificadas. Portanto, não há contradição, há apenas uma complementariedade entre um instrumento e esta ação natureza mais prática, mais política, mais de policy making que decorre das cimeiras.
Obrigado. Então, nesse sentido, se pudesse colocar só mais 2 últimas perguntas finais, precisamente, mais uma vez, para não tentar abusar muito do seu tempo, mas seria possível, mencionou as áreas, enfim, de parceria que foram avançadas num período pré-pandemia, em termos da cooperação e do relacionamento entre a UE e a UA, mas existe uma pergunta especificamente centrada na questão da suspensão do serviço de dívida e até que ponto é que foi possível ou não haver desenvolvimentos nesse sentido durante este processo e durante o período mais recente perante as tais restrições, enfim, de maiores contactos entre as duas partes. E por último, peço desculpa, não iremos ser possível cobrir todas as perguntas, mas se seria possível elaborar um pouco mais sobre como estas questões de segurança e desenvolvimento poderão eventualmente figurar de forma mais central na consideração da missão que está a ser planeada com relação a Moçambique e ao caso específico de Cabo Delgado, que depois parece apresentar-se como um cenário relativamente quase que imediato para a consideração destas questões que temos vindo a discutir estes 2 dias. E creio que seriam estas 2 perguntas. Muito obrigado.
Pois. Em relação ao serviço da dívida, como sabem, quer dizer, as instituições da União Europeia ou a Comissão Europeia ou o Conselho não têm dívida na sua posse, não é? Portanto, nós não podemos, as instituições não podem tomar a decisão de anular a dívida, mas o que tem acontecido é que temos as instituições, o Presidente do Conselho Europeu tomou este assunto muito, enfim, pessoalmente, e a Presidente da Comissão Europeia também. O que a União Europeia tem feito tem sido facilitadora, sobretudo, de contactos, e tem também uma presença no G20, não é? Portanto, em que exprime a vontade dos países da União Europeia, portanto, para ajudar a facilitar o alívio da dívida, que tem sido considerado essencial pelos países africanos, e por isso por ser evidente que era essencial que nesta fase de crise mais aguda, que o peso do serviço da dívida não viesse ainda a agravar ainda mais a situação orçamental dos países africanos. Portanto, essa tem sido a filosofia. É interessante notar o posicionamento de alguns países africanos em relação a esta questão da dívida, porque eles próprios também não querem ficar reféns de um excessivo adiamento do serviço da dívida e depois todo o impacto que isso tem nas suas cotações pelas agências de rating, e portanto é este debate que tem sido realizado, tem também isso em conta, a consciência consciência de que é preciso, é verdade, aliviar a dívida, é importante que haja um perdão de dívida sempre que possível, mas isso obviamente depois também depende das capacidades orçamentais dos países que são detentores dessa dívida, mas também ter em conta a preocupação dos africanos de não ficarem excessivamente conotados com dívidas cada vez mais significativas. Os ministros das Finanças, por exemplo, do Ghana e do Quénia, no início foram logo muito focais nessa questão e foi muito evidente o seu receio de que este assunto fosse também tratado tendo em conta essa preocupação. A missão em Moçambique é uma missão que decorre do pedido que foi feito pelas autoridades moçambicanas. Isso é muito importante, eu não o disse, mas é óbvio que é o ponto de partida. Portanto, o que o presidente Nyusi pediu ao Sr. Ministro dos Negócios Estrangeiros, que esteve em Maputo em representação do alto representante, eu acompanhei-o nessa deslocação, foi que a União Europeia reforçasse as ações de apoio humanitário na província de Cabo Delgado, tendo em conta os deslocações das populações naquela região, o apoio às ações de cooperação para o desenvolvimento, que a União Europeia já tem vindo a desenvolver de forma muito significativa. Moçambique é um dos maiores receptores de ajuda para o desenvolvimento da União Europeia. Os números que estão agora em cima da mesa para o novo quadro de programação 2021-2027, no quadro deste novo instrumento, no NDICI, ou IVDCI, acho eu na sigla portuguesa, são de novo muito expressivos e, portanto, a União Europeia continuará a trabalhar muito nessa área, centrando-se em áreas, procurando uma ação muito focada nas áreas da educação e também da transformação, da proteção climática e da transformação energética. São as principais áreas de apoio da União Europeia, e também pediu o presidente Nyusi que a União Europeia fornecesse treino para as forças especiais moçambicanas e, portanto, esta missão da União Europeia está exatamente a desenhar-se no sentido de ser fornecido esse treino que, por exemplo, à imagem do que se faz noutras missões, como muito no Sahel, também na Somália, sendo que, como sempre acontece nestas missões da União Europeia, há normalmente um país que constitui o núcleo duro da missão e à volta do qual se constrói a missão europeia e como bem sabem, Portugal já anunciou o seu apoio, aliás já concretizou, já assinou um memorando de entendimento e as conversações que agora estão a ter lugar em Moçambique estão muito não só a realizar-se com as autoridades moçambicanas, mas muito também com os militares portugueses, exatamente para se definir a melhor forma de atuação. Vai ser muito importante porque é óbvio que este apoio da União Europeia ajudará à resolução do problema, mas não será por si só suficiente. Ver como é que, se eventualmente uma força regional da SADC vai ou não avançar para também dar apoio às forças moçambicanas. Como sabem, foi agora anunciado uma cimeira da SADC para os próximos dias, próxima semana em Maputo, portanto em que essa questão vai ser também tratada e, portanto, vai ser muito importante que também essa articulação seja feita. Aliás, nós temos tido essa preocupação constante de estar em permanente contacto com a SADC para ir informando quais é que são as nossas intenções, o que é que tem vindo a ser feito. Haverá uma reunião ministerial com a SADC em junho, enfim, eu tenho tido contactos com o secretariado executivo da SADC também, portanto esperamos que estas ações sejam complementares e possam da melhor forma ajudar enfim, estancar pelo menos para já este problema da insurgência no norte do país e evitar o alastramento, que é uma grande preocupação que temos todos, não é? Para outras províncias moçambicanas e também para países da região.
Muito obrigado, doutora Rita. Infelizmente chegámos ao fim do nosso tempo alocado para este efeito. Nós gostaríamos de lhe agradecer muito pela sua disponibilidade para estar connosco esta manhã e, enfim, honrar todo este encerramento do evento e proporcionar-nos esta panorâmica e algumas informações sobre ações mais específicas e concretas do lado da União Europeia com relação à África e à UA e, no fundo, a ajudar-nos a encerrar estes 2 dias de trabalhos dedicados a estes temas. E, portanto, gostaríamos de lhe agradecer muito mais uma vez por estar connosco.
Prazer.
E sem mais demoras, eu passaria então a palavra ao professor Luís Nuno Rodrigues, diretor do Centro dos Nacionais do ISCTE, para também dizer umas breves palavras.
Muito obrigado, Pedro. Gostaria de começar por agradecer à doutora Rita Laranjinha, a diretora-geral para a África do Serviço Europeu de Ação Externa. Muito obrigado pela sua presença, pela sua intervenção, que de facto permitiu fechar com chave de ouro esta conferência. Esperamos também estar à altura do seu repto, a determinada altura, para que os centros de investigação universitários continuem a estudar e a investigar a realidade africana. E essa é de facto a nossa tradição aqui no ISCTE, no outrora Centro de Estudos Africanos, agora Centro de Estudos Internacionais, ao nível da investigação, mas também nos nossos programas de ensino, mestrado, doutoramento em estudos africanos. Portanto, registrei com agrado o seu repto, digamos assim. Mas muito obrigado pela sua gentileza, pela sua disponibilidade. Para nós também é importante este estímulo vindo dos decisores, vindo dos atores no terreno. E, portanto, eu penso que a sua intervenção, de facto, encerrou da melhor maneira estes dois dias de trabalho, muito profícuo, pelas sessões que pude assistir e também pelo feedback que me foi chegando. Penso que a conferência atingiu em pleno os seus objetivos, constituindo-se não apenas como um fórum que nos permitiu, de certa maneira, diagnosticar a situação no que diz respeito, enfim, ao tema geral da conferência, o nexo segurança e desenvolvimento e os desafios que a este respeito se colocam para Portugal, para a Europa e para a África, mas não apenas diagnosticar a situação, dizia eu, mas também, conforme referi nas minhas palavras de abertura, constituir um ponto de partida, não é? Através da produção de conhecimento, contribuindo para o debate interdisciplinar sobre estas temáticas e, desejavelmente, contribuir também para uma melhor definição de políticas públicas, nacionais e europeias, nesta área da segurança humana e do desenvolvimento. E, por conseguinte, chegado a este ponto, um pouco mais a dizer, apenas reiterar os meus agradecimentos em nome do ISCTE e em nome do Centro de Estudos Internacionais, agradecimentos a todos os oradores, a todos os moderadores, a todos os participantes, agradecimentos à audiência e às questões tão pertinentes que foram colocando, e, obviamente, às instituições parceiras, ao Instituto da Defesa Nacional, na pessoa da sua diretora, a professora Helena Carreiras, à entidade, digamos, financiadora deste projeto e desta conferência, naturalmente, o Camões, Instituto da Cooperação e da Língua, e expressando os meus sinceros desejos de que esta colaboração se prolongue no futuro, no âmbito deste projeto, que ainda não terminou, obviamente, mas de outros projetos que venham também no futuro. Gostava também de deixar uma palavra para a entidade responsável pela tradução simultânea deste evento, um recurso muito útil, e terminar com um agradecimento àquelas e àqueles que nas duas instituições, ISCTE e Instituto da Defesa Nacional, e perdoem-me se me escapa algum nome, mas àqueles que asseguraram a organização, a divulgação, enfim, o sucesso desta conferência, com o destaque, como também disse inicialmente, para os doutores Pedro Seabra, Inês Ribeiro, Júlia Daniel, Tânia Santos e Filipa Amaral. E, portanto, a todas e a todos o meu muito obrigado.
E por último, acho que passaríamos então também a palavra à senhora diretora do Instituto de Defesa Nacional, a professora Helena Carreiras.
Muito bem, muito obrigada, Pedro. Eu podia dizer, faço minhas as palavras do professor Luís Nuno Rodrigues e terminava já aqui, porque justamente aquilo que havia a dizer ele já disse, mas claro, renovo em nome do Instituto da Defesa Nacional os agradecimentos à doutora Rita Laranjinha, a todos os restantes conferencistas, moderadores desta excelente conferência, que mostrou uma vez mais a justeza, a bondade desta opção de nos associarmos e cooperarmos para a realização deste tipo de eventos e de outros projetos que temos em curso, na medida em que enriqueceu profundamente, penso eu, o nosso trabalho comum e nos coloca em melhor posição para concretizar o repto que a doutora Rita Laranjinha nos deixou, que eu também justamente iria referir para enfim, expressar a vontade do IDN de prosseguir neste trabalho de parcerias, de estabelecimento de contactos e manutenção desses contactos entre os centros europeus, os nossos centros e os centros africanos, para manter viva esta ligação que nos permitirá seguramente identificar e intervir melhor naquilo que são as questões da segurança e do desenvolvimento que nos ocupam a todos. E, portanto, muito obrigado, foi um grande gosto, um grande prazer estar com o Instituto Camões, o Camões e o Instituto da Cooperação e da Língua, o Centro de Estudos Internacionais, a quem agradeço. Foi um win-win para todos nós, um agradecimento a todos, às equipas das várias instituições que organizaram este evento e desejar a todos uma boa continuação dos trabalhos e das reflexões que podem ser o follow-up desta conferência. Muito obrigada a todos. E penso que com estas palavras, não sei se o Pedro se abriria a fazê-lo, mas faço eu, está então encerrada esta excelente, magnífica conferência. Muito boa tarde a todos.